Hi, KRB teachers. Welcome back to the Maximize Being the Best Version of Yourself webinar series. Today, we are focusing on diverse learners and understanding classroom diversity. A reminder of the overview of the webinar series, and today we are looking at the second webinar in the module focusing on your relationship with students on diverse learners. So getting started, what are we going to be learning about today? Hopefully, I am going to help teach you to identify and manage the various learning styles and behavioural challenges of students. We'll start with looking at what are diverse learners and diversity. Then we'll look at learning styles and managing those learning styles. Then we'll move on to learning disorders and managing learning disorders. And finally, look at mental illness disorders and managing those in the classroom. Starting with diverse learners. Firstly, diversity is defined in this way. All students, no matter who they are or where they are across the country in Australia, have the opportunity to participate fully in the curriculum, and that refers to the many students around the country with diverse needs. If we look further into understanding diversity, this may be students with a disability, with mental health issues, students from a background where English is not their first language, and also gifted and talented students. Interestingly, 1 in 5 or 20% of Australian students receive adjustments to some form of provision. This includes in their teaching and learning, communication, personal care, health and safety, and access. So why is it really important to understand diversity? Well, there's short-term benefits firstly. This can help you to understand how to support your students who might be struggling with learning content, and it can also help with efficiency and productivity in your classroom. The longer-term benefits of understanding diversity helps to ensure students' self-esteem and motivation to learn are boosted in the long run. Can also help reduce the risk of dropout and attrition and also absenteeism, but also increase academic results. Embracing diversity. Essentially, all students have unique interests, strengths, goals, and learning needs. And we looked at this in the previous webinar series, and I would remind you to go back to those from last term to gain a deeper understanding about your students and in terms of their strengths and interests and abilities. Challenges to learning can be worked on and amended over time, and I think that's really important, knowing that, yes, some people do have different types of learning styles or perhaps those disorders and illnesses that we'll look at today, but they're adopting that growth mindset. These can be made, adjustments can be made for these sorts of things and provisions. Something that also was brought up in the feedback that you've provided, so thank you for whoever that was, but importantly, it's important to note not to over pathologize. So sometimes we can have a tendency to put students in particular buckets. Of course, you're probably aware of the Pygmalion effect and the impacts that can have on the students, but also not just bucketing them in categories such as, they're anxious or have anxiety or they've got ADHD. So how can we look at incorporating their strengths and that growth mindset that we can work with those strengths and abilities rather than pathologizing them. On that note, it's important to keep in mind neuroplasticity. And of course, this is about how the brain does have the ability to rewire itself. Reinforcement particularly can help in developing those new neural pathways, which can help in the face of different learning challenges. Also, as covered, strengths and focusing on that positive psychology and strengths and self-esteem approach can really help those students with learning disorders and disabilities, and showing them that those strengths can compensate despite and in fact in light of those learning disorders. Today we're going to be looking at 3 different types of diverse learners. We're going to start by looking at learning styles, then we'll look at learning disorders, and then finally mental illness disorders. So starting with learning styles. The VARK model of learning styles suggests that students typically have a preferred style in learning in a visual, auditory, read or write, and/or kinesthetic way. Visual learners learn best when information is presented in a visual format. They prefer pictures, mental images, and that helps them. Auditory learners learn best through listening and verbal communication, and they understand and retain information better when it's presented through spoken words. Read or write learners learn best when written words are in text-based material, and they understand when it's presented in written form. And finally, kinesthetic learners learn best with hands-on experience and activities, and they thrive when they can actually move around, touch, manipulate, and interact with learning material. So how can you as a teacher manage and cater to these different learning styles? Once identified whether a student is, for instance, a visual learner, some things that you can adopt here would be to understand that they will typically learn best with things like maps, diagrams, charts, graphs, flowcharts, pictures. For your auditory learners, focus on things like lectures, classroom discussions, reading to them, using mobile phones, radio, talking things through and having those class discussions. Your read or write learners understand information when it's presented typically as books, articles, reports, notes, and any other written information, so text. And finally, those kinesthetic learners learn best when we make use of physical demonstrations, when they can actually get involved themselves, models, real life examples, role playing, and hands-on. I'd encourage you now to bring out your worksheet that corresponds to this section, which has been on learning styles, and just choose one of the learning styles we've just looked at it and think about even just one way you can engage students with this particular style in your classroom. Moving on to learning disorders. Did you firstly know that 1 in 10 people in Australia have a learning disability? And children often develop problems, as we've looked at, in terms of their self-esteem, and they're at greater risk of dropping out of school, which is why we're going to cover what are these sorts of disabilities today. So what are the most common types of learning disorders? Learning disorders can include dyslexia, which may be one that you're familiar with, but there's also additional ones including dysfluency, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia. Firstly, dyslexia. This is problems with accurate or fluent word recognition, poor decoding, and poor spelling abilities. I'll just let you read some of those other challenges on the screen. Dysgraphia is actually a neurological disorder where a person's writing is distorted or incorrect. And again, I'll let you read some of those. Dyscalculia is problems processing numerical information, learning arithmetic facts, and performing accurate or fluent calculations. Here are some examples also of what that might look like. Dysfluency or stuttering is the unexpected disturbance in the normal patterns and flow of speech, and this is what that can look like in your students. And finally, dyspraxia, motor disorders and poor coordination. And this is what that would look like in your students if you'd like to read those. So how can you as a teacher manage these learning disorders in the classroom? There's essentially 3 steps that we can take here. So firstly, working with professionals and those in the team that are associated with your student. So these may be outside parents, they're different specialists that they go to understand and really learn about what are their challenges. Then drawing up a plan to help to cater to that particular student. Then we'll look at some of the many teaching techniques that you can particularly adopt depending on which type of learning disorder that student may have. So for a student with dyslexia, Some classroom accommodations you might like to consider is reading out loud instructions, converting text to speech, having larger text, adopting visual schedules, and tools to actually focus on reading. For dysgraphia, you could consider spell check and grammar, additional checks in place for them, such as things like Grammarly, keyboards and touchscreens, dictation, speech to text, handwriting tools, and also word prediction. Dyscalculia, you could consider self-talk and drawing, more board games, graph paper when doing things in the math space, for instance, or science, worksheets and structured adjustments. Dysfluency classroom accommodations can include catering to that kinesthetic learning style, providing written assignments or other alternative options, using visual aids, and also allowing extra time for discussions and presentations. And finally, dyspraxia classroom accommodations can include attending to their underlying skills and strengths, modelling tasks in a physical visual way so they can see that, breaking down into specific physical skills, catering to the visual learning style, and also to their auditory learning style. I would again encourage you to please get out your worksheet and, choosing one of these learning disorders we've just looked at, think about how you can accommodate this disorder for a particular student. And finally, mental illness disorders as our third type of diverse learner. Important to remind you, and we've looked at this in the previous webinar series, but mental illnesses have to cause clinically significant distress, which means it must interfere with their life functioning, both at school, but also potentially at home and in their work situation if they have one. They're enduring. It's not just a point of time. Across the board, the standard is particularly at least 2 weeks. Must be professionally diagnosed, despite the preference sometimes to Google and hear a lot of students that have diagnosed themselves on TikTok, and more than just naughty, inappropriate, or socially deviant behaviour. That though can be indicative of ODD, or oppositional defiant disorder, or conduct disorder, which we'll look at today. In the short term, having a mental illness disorder can also hinder their emotional, cognitive, and social development. It can result in the learning and difficulties in attention in class, and present as having challenges in relationships. In the longer term, they may have delayed emotional maturity and resilience, lower educational attainment, and also have potentially withdrawal and increased risk of substance abuse. These are some of the mental illnesses that you may be familiar with. And as we've looked at previously, the most common mental illnesses in teenage girls are anxiety, which is almost 1 in 3, depression, almost 1 in 5, ADHD, 1 in 10, and then conduct disorder and eating disorders, about 1 in 20, or 6%. So anxiety disorders are defined as the group of disorders that have their central organizing system and the emotional state of fear, worry, or excessive apprehension. Symptoms of these may look like, or you may hear of students speaking of intrusive thoughts, trouble sleeping, increased worry, sweating, nightmares, anger, outbursts, or particular irritability, trembling, racing heart, dizziness, sweating without exercising, and avoiding activities. Depressive disorders is the negative affective state ranging from unhappiness and discontent to an extreme feeling of sadness, pessimism, and despondency that interferes with daily life. Symptoms to look out for here is a lack of energy for no good reason, an inability to concentrate, feelings or expressions of worthlessness, drastic weight loss or gain, sleeping pattern disruptions, feelings of extreme sadness or despair, and a loss of interest in activities, particularly those that they used to be interested in. ADHD is the persistent pattern of inattention and/or hyperactivity or impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. And there's one of two subtypes. They may have inattention and/or hyperactive or impulsive subtype. So, inattention is that daydreaming, procrastination, forgetfulness, inability to stay on task and seem not to listen. Hyperactive or impulsive, on the other hand, is that more excessive fidgeting, restlessness, talking, overactivity, busyness, can't sit still, can't sit in their seat, and sometimes intruding on other people's activities. Conduct disorder, as mentioned before, is a serious violation of basic rights or others' social norms and rules. Wouldn't expect these to necessarily be in students at KRB, but given it is as common now as eating disorders, just something to keep in mind. And this, unlike ODD or oppositional defiant disorder that I just mentioned before, is diagnosed in their high school years, so after the age of 12. This typically looks like aggressive or violent behaviour, deceitful and disrespectful. And finally, eating disorders. Any disorder characterised primarily by pathological disturbance of attitudes and behaviours related specifically to food. As we looked at previously, the most common, of about 1 in 2 of the eating disorders, is binge eating disorder. Symptoms of eating disorders can include a pathological disturbance of attitudes and behaviours. We've just looked at that. Struggles with eating in front of others. You might recognise that they don't want to sit with their friends at lunch and eat. Hard to tell from just observation, but they tend to have an obsessive thought about food, weight, or eating, and that could come out in some of their discussions, perhaps. Rigid rules or rituals around eating, and again, purging. So how can you as a teacher manage mental illness disorders? For anxiety, really suggest you allow breaks for managing when they have symptoms. Some students might have panic attacks, get overwhelmed, and need that time to step out of class. Really creating a safe space for them or having one that's designated, excuse me. Not requiring to read out loud or work at the board, particularly if they have that fear of performance anxiety. And allow them to take their tests separately in quiet environments. For depression, make physical activities a part of daily classroom routine. Exercise really helps those with depression. Always offer support and encouragement, and particularly attend to what they've done well and that praise. Give them extra time to complete assignments and allow for regular break times. For ADHD, helping provide extra warnings before transitions and changes to routine. Removing distractions from classroom. Some students have mentioned even the clicking of a clock can be a cause for distraction for them. Post written schedules for daily routines so they know what to expect. And short quizzes rather than one long test if you can break things up into smaller activities or assessments. Conduct disorder. Providing students with options. Would you like to do X or Y? So at least there's some boundaries there. Maintaining calm, respectful, and detached approach. Establishing very clear classroom rules and rewarding appropriate classroom behaviour. And we'll look at this next week when we're setting boundaries, particularly for things like conduct disorder. We look at those clear classroom rules and expectations and also that positive reinforcement. And finally, managing eating disorders. Allow the student to eat in a comfortable, discreet setting. Respect their privacy and confidentiality, particularly with eating disorders, is very personal. It's often linked a lot to perfectionism and not wanting to have any sign of weakness or present to be weak. So do respect their privacy. Be cautious when discussing things like food, weight, or body image, particularly in your learning content, things like PDHPE, and be mindful of activities involving food in the classroom. And finally, if you can grab your worksheet again and fill out there's a space choosing one mental illness disorder. Think about how you can adapt your teaching in the classroom to cater to those. To summarise today, what did we hopefully learn? Diverse learners include those with different learning styles, learning disorders, and mental illness disorders. There are 4 types of learning styles: visual, auditory, read or write, and kinesthetic. We can manage these by making modifications to your teaching instruction according to their learning style. The most common learning disorders are dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, dysfluency, and dyspraxia. We can manage these by working with professionals, drawing up a plan, and modifying your teaching techniques accordingly. The most common mental illness disorders in teenage girls are anxiety, depression, ADHD, conduct disorder, and eating disorders. And we can manage these by making various classroom modifications to accommodate to these illness disorders, trying to avoid the triggers that may set them off, and also offering flexible deadlines and alternative assessments. Finally, some resources. If you do need these, here are these available to you for emergency lines and Lifeline, Kids Helpline, Beyond Blue. You've also got access to Maximize and free for the first period using the KRB 2024 promo code. If you have any further questions or feedback, please let me know and see you next week.